The term hot box relates to when the journal on the wheel catches on fire. Truck sides have what they call a journal box, where the end of the axle and the bearing and everything is up inside that journal box, lubricated by back in the old days it was lubricated by a journal pad that was soaked in oil. Well, when the bearing goes bad, or the journal gets all scratched and pitted or wore out or damaged, it starts to produce heat and it'll melt the lid right out of the babbitt on the bearing. And eventually the wheel got so hot the metal would start turning red hot, which in turn would catch the journal box on fire, which was already full of oil. And it was not uncommon to see a friction bearing wheel come down the line with what they call the hot box. It would literally be in flames, to the point often it would catch the railroad car on fire. We're talking about flames high as a person shooting up from that wheel. Well, they still call it a hot box even today when a roller bearing journal goes bad and overheats. And it'll still melt the journal completely in half to the point the journal breaks off and wreck the train if they don't stop it. Nowadays you got hot box detectors so sensitive that it will detect the heat of a cigarette nearby. So it's very uncommon for a hot box to wreck a train anymore, but back in the old days it was one of the major causes of train wrecks. Well, back in the old days, I'd say old days, it ain't been that long ago. It was often determined by the conductor himself who would ride on the rear, because the conductor, he is or was the boss of the train. It always amazed me every time I tell somebody I work for the railroad, was you an engineer? Well, the engineer drives the train, but he don't run it. He's not the boss. Your conductor is. But my job was a railway carman. Back in the old days, you had a flagman or a conductor riding on a caboose. He would be sitting in the seat near the cupola where he could look up and down to both sides of the train, especially in curves. You can see way on up the train. And if something like a hot box occurred, he could see the smoke and even smell it. He had the power to apply the brakes from the rear of the train and go ahead and stop the train. Or often somebody would signal him and let him know he had a hot box, or yell up. Somebody, the same way on the head end, somebody on the head end is watching both sides of the train, looking back for any possible problems, and they often saw the hot box themselves. When the train stopped, immediately, conductor, flagman would be walking towards that hot box. When they got back there to the car, oftentimes that journal would be on fire. Well, they carried the stuff, this powder chemical, in later years. I don't know what they did in the real old days. It kind of looked like a can of Ajax cleanser, that type of thing, where you could shake this powder out of the can. And what it was a powder fire extinguisher. Nowadays they put that powder in a regular fire extinguisher and just push a button and squirt that powder right on the fire, and it'll extinguish what they call a Class B fire, an oil fire. But they carried that extinguisher chemical back to the journal box. Oftentimes they could shake that powder in there and get the fire put out, because the axle would slowly start cooling back down once you stopped, because it'd be red hot, oftentimes to the point that the car would be on fire. The idea was to get the fire put out. They had this gummy wax-looking substance called culottes. You shove it up in the journal. It was really for lubricating the journal to get it to a siding, or oftentimes they would just pull the car at a walking speed to the nearest siding and set it out, put their train back together and go on without it. Well, that's where your car repairman comes in handy. He has to go out there and determine whether that car will make it to a siding or to a shop. He has to go out there and determine whether that car will make it to a shop or whether the wheel needs to be changed right there on the spot. And oftentimes we did. We had a truck with a pair of wheels on it. We'd take the wheels with us, jack that car up right there in the siding, put the new pair of wheels in there, and later the car would be picked up and carried on its way. Sometimes what we would do would take a journal jack and raise that journal up, pull the wedge and the brass is the bearing, pull the bearing out off the top of the journal, look up in there, and if it wasn't too bad, it was just pitted or something, we could stick some culox in there and lay the brass on top of it and put the wedge back and let it down. The weight of the car would squish that stuff all around the bearing and it could make it to a shop. But most often, by the time it got on fire and damaged, the wheels had to be changed out there on the spot. Many a train wreck was caused by a hot box.